Snow fell like ash from the sky, soft but endless. Each flake melted too quickly on her burning skin. The girl walked barefoot across the frozen street, her legs shaking, her arms wrapped around herself. She had no jacket, no shoes, no name that anyone here knew. Her skin was pale violet, cracked and bruised. Her long white hair stuck to her face, frozen at the tips. No one stopped to help. Not even the machines rolling by on silent wheels. She didn't cry anymore. There were no tears left. She had come from the outer ring. Smuggled in a container, she escaped when the trader stopped at a fueling post. For 3 days, she had eaten nothing. For 2, she had not slept. Now, on the 3rd day. The snowstorm had swallowed her whole. Her steps slowed. Her knees buckled. She crawled toward a wall and leaned her back against it. The cold crept through her skin and reached her bones. A tiny whimper left her lips, not a cry for help, just the last sound she could make. Her body curled like a dying animal, and her eyes began to close. A soft light blinked from a window above. Someone was watching. Jack stood behind a cracked window in the storehouse. He had lived there alone for years. After the war, after the loss, he stopped talking to people, stopped trusting anything that wasn't made of stone or steel. But tonight, something moved outside. He grabbed his thermal scope and scanned the snowy street. Then he saw her, a girl, barely moving, lying near the steps of the old building, alien. Yes, he could tell by the skin color and those pointed ears. But small, too thin, too quiet to be a threat. She wasn't a spy, wasn't a thief. She looked like something the universe had chewed up and spat out. Jack grumbled under his breath. "Not my problem," he told himself. He tried to walk away, but stopped at the door. She was still there, and now she wasn't moving at all. He opened the door. The cold stabbing his face like knives, snow howled into the hallway. He walked over quickly and knelt down beside her. She was barely breathing, her skin ice cold to the touch. When he touched her arm, she flinched but didn't open her eyes. She weighed nothing when he lifted her. Like a bundle of frozen cloth and broken glass, back inside, Jack placed her gently on a cot near the heater. He wrapped her in a thick blanket and checked for wounds. Old scars, burn marks. Bruises too dark to be recent. She had been through hell, no doubt about it. He lit a thermal pad and tucked it near her chest. Slowly, her skin began to regain color. He poured hot water into a cup and left it beside her. She didn't wake, but her fingers moved slightly. She was alive. Jack sat in the chair across from her and stared. "Who the hell are you?" he whispered. She didn't answer, just kept shivering under the blankets. Outside, the storm grew louder. But inside the room, there was only quiet breathing and the soft hum of heat. Jack rubbed his tired eyes and leaned back in the chair. He told himself he'd throw her out in the morning. Just one night, he thought, just until the storm passed. But deep down, he already knew she wasn't leaving. Not until she was warm, safe, and healed. Not while he was still breathing. And so, the human who had shut his door on the world opened it for one freezing alien girl. Jack didn't sleep that night. He sat in the old chair, boots still on. His eyes fixed on the blanket where the girl lay. The heater buzzed gently, pushing back the frost creeping in from the windows. Outside, the snowstorm roared like a wounded beast, but inside, everything was still except for the rising and falling of her chest. Every few minutes, she stirred, murmuring words he didn't understand. Sometimes it sounded like crying, sometimes like begging. Jack didn't speak her language, but pain had its own voice, and he understood it well. He got up quietly and brought over a bowl of warm soup. It was simple, just water, salt, and some root vegetables, but hot. He set it beside the cot and gently touched her shoulder. The girl flinched hard, gasping and sitting up in panic. Her wide silver eyes searched the room like a cornered animal. She scrambled backward, hitting the wall with her back. Her chest rose and fell fast, her thin hands clawing at the blanket. "Easy," Jack said calmly, raising both hands. "You're safe." She didn't understand the words, but something in his tone made her pause. He pushed the bowl forward slowly. Steam rose from it in little clouds, her eyes locked onto it. And for a long second, she didn't move. Then so slowly it hurt to watch, she crawled forward and sniffed the soup. She sipped once, then again, and then drank it all like her life depended on it. When she was done, her body relaxed just a little. She looked at Jack with cautious eyes. Still trembling, but no longer wild, Jack sat down across the room and let her be. He didn't speak again. He just nodded once and stayed quiet for a while. There was only the sound of wind and breathing. The next morning, she was still there, wrapped tightly in the blanket, her eyes half open, watching Jack cook another meal. She hadn't run. That surprised him most would have, after seeing the scar on his face or the way his arm clicked when he moved. But she hadn't flinched this time, not the way people usually did. Jack placed a cup of warm water on the table. She stared at it. Then at him, her lips moved, trying to form a word. It came out broken, cracked by cold and fear. "Lyra," she whispered. Jack blinked. "What?" She tapped her chest weakly. "Lyra, her name. That was her name." Jack leaned back and let out a long breath. He nodded, pointing to himself. "Jack, yeah, KK." She repeated softly. They sat in silence again. But now it wasn't cold silence. It was something else, fragile, uncertain, but beginning to grow. That evening, Jack stood at his workbench, fixing an old thermal coil. Behind him, he heard the quietest footsteps. He turned, and there she was, still wrapped in the blanket, her head bowed, her hands holding something. It was his broken knife. He hadn't even noticed it was missing. She had cleaned it and tried to fix the handle with cloth and wire. She held it out to him like an offering. He took it slowly and nodded. "Thanks," he said. Unsure if she understood, but Lyra smiled just for a second, and that was enough. Later, she pointed at the door, then at herself. "Go," she said, trying hard to pronounce it. Jack shook his head. "No, storm." He mimed the wind and shivering cold. She lowered her head, understanding. Then she said something else, something soft. It sounded like her language, but he heard one word clearly. "Stay." Jack looked at her. She stood there, thin, fragile, but trying to be strong, asking a question with her whole body, not just her voice. He nodded slowly. "Yes, stay." He gave her a small room, bare, dusty, but warm. She walked around it like it was a palace, touched the bed, the walls, the window. Then sat on the floor, hugging her knees. For the first time in what felt like years, Jack closed his eyes that night and slept. Not because he trusted her, not because the war inside him had ended, but because someone else was breathing under his roof. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. Lyra didn't speak much, but she watched everything. Every corner of the cabin, every movement Jack made, every noise outside. She noticed it all. She moved carefully, like someone used to being punished for stepping too loud. She never asked for anything, never touched what wasn't hers. But each day, she stayed. And that said more than words ever could. Jack was used to silence. He lived with it for years. But now the silence had shapes, small, quiet, silver-eyed, and always watching. Lyra had become part of the cabin, like the worn walls and the creaky door. Only difference was, she breathed. One morning, Jack walked in from cutting wood and found her sitting by the stove. She held his old screwdriver in her hand and was carefully tightening the screws on a broken kettle. Her fingers were clumsy but focused. He didn't interrupt. Just stood in the doorway and watched. When she saw him, she froze. Then quickly placed the screwdriver down and backed away. Jack raised a hand slowly. "It's okay," he said. "You can use it." Lyra blinked, unsure. Then she nodded once small. But real, Jack gave her a quiet task that afternoon, sorting wires in the toolbox. She finished it like it was a test, and when she brought it back, organized and clean, he couldn't help but smile. "You're not useless," he muttered. She didn't understand the words, but she saw the way his face changed. And smiled back just a little. She never asked questions, but she noticed his limp. The way his left hand trembled when he tried to grip heavy tools, and how he avoided looking at a certain door in the hallway. The door with the faded nameplate. Amelia, that night, while Jack fixed the generator. Lyra wandered through the hall, her feet silent on the wooden floor. The door wasn't locked, so she pushed it open slowly. Inside, the room smelled of dust and old paper. A child's bed, long untouched, toys still lined the shelf. Pictures drawn in crayons faded on the wall. In the center of the desk was a photo, a human girl, maybe 7 years old, with wide brown eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Beside her stood Jack. Younger, standing proud in a soldier's uniform. Lyra stared at it for a long time, then closed the door gently. Later, Jack noticed she seemed quieter, more thoughtful. At dinner, she pointed toward the hallway. "Amelia," she asked softly. Jack's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. He didn't answer right away. Then finally said, "My daughter Lyra." Looked down, then up again. "Gone?" she whispered. Jack nodded, voice dry. "Yeah, a long time ago." There was silence between them again, but this time it felt like shared silence. She didn't ask more, and he didn't explain, but something shifted that night. Not trust at least not yet, but understanding. The next day, Lyra began sweeping the floor without being told. She folded the blankets, organized the shelves, and even tried cooking something using root starch and herbs. It tasted horrible, but Jack ate it anyway. She watched his face like it was a test, and when he said not bad, her whole body relaxed. She stayed near the cabin most of the time, but once Jack caught her staring at the snowy forest beyond the hill, looking for something. He asked. She shrugged and said, "Just quiet." Jack nodded. "That forest isn't friendly." She tilted her head. Neither was the galaxy. He couldn't argue with that. That night, there was a knock on the door. Jack froze, reaching for his old rifle. Lyra moved behind a wall, eyes wide, heart racing. No one ever visited. Jack opened the door slowly. It was a local trader, asking for help with a broken hover sled. Lyra watched from the shadows as Jack dealt with the man calm and cold. When the trader left, Jack closed the door and turned to her. "You don't have to hide," he said. Lyra stepped out slowly. "They might take me." Jack looked her in the eye. "Not if you're with me." Her breath caught. She didn't answer. But in her silence was something heavy, something grateful. That night, she didn't sleep in the corner. She slept in the room Jack had cleaned for her, under a real blanket, with the door open for the first time in a long time. The cabin didn't feel so empty. Jack didn't say it out loud, but in the space between them, something was growing, a strange bond, fragile, quiet, but real. And neither of them would be alone again. Lyra woke up in the middle of the night, sweating. Her heart pounded like it wanted to break through her chest. The cabin was quiet, the fire low, but her mind was loud. She sat up slowly, eyes darting around the small room. She wasn't in a cage. She wasn't in the dark cargo hold anymore, but her body didn't know that, not yet. Jack was still asleep in the other room, breathing soft and steady. She stood and stepped quietly across the wooden floor. Each board creaked like thunder in her ears. She hated loud sounds. They reminded her of collars tightening, of doors slamming shut, of angry voices yelling in a language she couldn't understand. She stopped at the kitchen table and touched the edge gently. The wood was warm from the fire, smooth and worn, not metal, not cold. Here, nothing had locked her up. Not yet, but the memory still lived in her bones. She pulled back her sleeve and stared at the mark on her arm, a symbol burned into her skin long ago on her ship. She touched it and closed her eyes. Her breathing quickened. She didn't hear Jack enter the room, but she felt his presence, quiet and heavy, like snow before. "It falls. What's wrong?" he asked softly. Lyra turned quickly, eyes wide with panic. Jack didn't move closer. He stayed by the doorway, calm and still. She pointed at the mark, her fingers trembling, then lowered her hand. Ashamed, Jack stepped forward. Slowly, he didn't touch her, he just looked at the mark, then at her eyes. "Who did that?" he asked. Lyra opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, she knelt and placed her forehead to the floor. "I belong to them," she whispered. "Not anymore." Jack stood frozen for a moment, then knelt too, not touching her, just sitting there on the cold floor beside her. "You don't belong to anyone now," he said quietly, "and especially not to me." She looked up slowly, uncertain. "No chain." Jack shook his head. "No chain, no command." "No command. Why?" He thought for a moment, then replied, "Because you're not a tool, Lyra. You're a person." The next morning, Lyra didn't hide her mark. She rolled her sleeves up and helped with the chores like always, but her steps were a little steadier now. Her shoulders not so tight. Jack noticed but didn't say anything. He just handed her a wrench and showed her how to fix the water pump. They worked side by side until dusk. Lyra smiled when she got it right the first time. Jack smiled too, but turned away before she saw it. Later that week, Jack took her to the storage room behind the cabin. He opened a metal trunk and pulled out something covered in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, a folded jacket, small, tough, and warm. "Made it for my daughter. Back when she was about your size," he said. "It should fit." Lyra didn't move at first. She stared at it like it was made of light, then reached out and touched the fabric. Her fingers traced the seams like they were sacred. She looked up at him, lips shaking. "For me?" Jack nodded. "Yeah." She held the jacket against her chest and whispered, "Thank you," then added something in her own language, soft and melodic. Jack didn't understand the words, but the way she said them made his chest tighten. That night, Lyra placed a small item beside Jack's bed while he slept. It was a folded scrap of cloth with symbols stitched in silver thread, a charm from her home world meant to protect families. She didn't know if he would understand what it meant, but she hoped he'd feel it. She stood there for a while, watching him breathe, then whispered the same word he had once used for her. "Person." In the days that followed, Jack taught her how-to trap game, sharpen tools, and patch wounds. Lyra learned quickly, her hands steady and her eyes sharp. But Jack also saw how she still flinched at thunder or sudden knocks. Some scars were still healing. Some never would. One afternoon, as they sat by the fire, Jack asked her quietly, "Do you ever think about going back to your people?" Lyra stared into the flames. "They're all gone," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "They sold me, or died, or forgot." Jack didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly and added another log to the fire. Lyra looked at him and asked, "Can I stay here?" Jack met her gaze and said without hesitation, "You already are." Winter began to loosen its grip. The snow melted slowly, leaving behind muddy trails and streams of cold water that slid down the hills. Birds returned to the sky, and small animals came out from hiding, but peace never lasts long. Not out here. And not for people with secrets. Lyra was smiling more these days. She wore the jacket Jack gave her everywhere where when it was too warm, she chopped firewood better than most grown men. She fixed the leak in the water pipe without help. And she had started singing softly in her own language while she worked. Jack noticed all of it. He didn't say anything he didn't need to. She knew he was proud, even if his face barely changed, but someone else had noticed her too. Someone who had been watching from the woods beyond the ridge, and they were not proud. They were interested that morning. Jack went into town for supplies. It was rare, but necessary. He told Lyra to stay close, not to answer the door, and to keep the fire going. She nodded and gave him a small wave. It was the first time he had left her alone. He hesitated at the door. "Remember?" he said. "Don't open for anyone but me." "I promise," she replied. As the hours passed, Lyra kept herself busy. She swept the floor, baked root bread, and fed the small pet fox that had started visiting the back porch. She even tried painting one of Jack's old mugs with berry dye, but just after sunset, there was a knock at the door. Lyra froze. 2 knocks, then a pause, then one more. It wasn't Jack's pattern. He had his own rhythm too fast. One slow, always the same. This wasn't him. She stood silent behind the table, heart pounding. A voice spoke from outside. "I'm looking for someone," it said, a male voice. "Rough. I heard a girl's been staying out here, violet skin, white hair. That sound familiar?" Lyra covered her mouth with both hands. Her legs were trembling, her breathing shallow. The voice continued. "Don't worry, I've got her papers. Just want to bring her back safely. She belongs to a client of mine." She backed away slowly. Shaking her head, the door shook slightly. He was trying to handle. "I know you're in there," he said. "Open the door before I kick it down." Miles away, Jack was driving his old crawler up the hill when he saw fresh footprints in the snow. Heavy boots, not his, not hers. Someone else had been there recently. He dropped the supply bag and ran. The rest of the way, gun in hand, heart racing, back at the cabin. The door finally burst open. The man stepped in tall, armored. A scanner on his wrist and stun cuffs on his belt. Lyra screamed and ran toward the back room, but he grabbed her wrist. "I've been looking for you," he growled. She kicked and thrashed, but he was stronger. "Easy now. I'm not gonna hurt you unless you make me." Suddenly, the door behind him slammed open. Jack stood there, covered in sweat and snow, rifle raised. "Let her go," he said, his voice low. The man turned, blinking in surprise. "This one. Yours?" He smirked. "Sorry, old man, she's not registered. Belongs to someone important." Jack didn't lower the gun. "She doesn't belong to anyone." The man chuckled. "You really want to die over a used-up alien girl?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "Try me." There was silence for a moment. Then the man dropped Lyra. Slowly raised his hands. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. "Not today," Jack replied. He kicked the man's scanner out the door and motioned toward the trees. "Walk," as the man left, muttering curses. Jack stood at the door until he vanished into the darkness. Then he turned to Lyra, who was sitting on the floor, arms wrapped around herself. She was shaking, her eyes wide, lips trembling. Jack knelt beside her and placed his hand on her shoulder. "I told you," he whispered. "No one gets to take you." That night, Lyra didn't sleep in her room. She curled up in a blanket by the fire. Too afraid to be alone, Jack didn't go to bed either. He sat beside her, loading bullets into his rifle, watching the window. The world outside had remembered her, but now it had to remember him too, because if they came again, they wouldn't be leaving whole. The forest was silent, too silent. Jack knew what that meant. Something was coming, something that didn't belong. He stood at the edge of the clearing, one hand on his old rifle, the other resting lightly on the hilt of a survival blade. His eyes scanned the tree line, not for animals but for men, the kind of men who sold others, the kind of men who never forgot a target that ran. Lyra stood behind him, barely breathing. She didn't ask questions. She didn't beg him to leave. She just stood there, one hand clutching the back of Jack's coat, like it was the only solid thing left in her world. He felt it too. She wasn't just a girl he had rescued anymore. She wasn't just a visitor or a guest. She was someone he would protect with everything. He had left. They came at sunset. 4 of them, armored, armed, and confident. One wore a polished chest plate with an alien sigil, some private hunter's badge. Another held a leash. A leash. Jack's jaw tightened. He stepped forward. Rifle aimed. Voice calm. "She's not going with you." The leader grinned. "You don't own her." He said, "We have the contracts, tags, and rights. You think I care about your papers?" Jack growled. "She's a person." The men laughed. "A person." One of them said, "She was bred to be obedient." "That's not a person. That's property." Lyra didn't cry. She didn't hide. She stepped forward and stood beside Jack, barefoot in the snow, with her eyes steady. "I am not what you say," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "I belong here." Jack lowered his gun slightly and said, "Last chance. Leave, or I'll bury you where you stand." They attacked, quick and cruel, like wolves. But Jack had been through worse. His first shot dropped the man with the leash. The second grazed the shoulder of another before the rifle jammed. He threw it aside and pulled his blade. The fight turned close and brutal. One slammed into Jack. Punching his ribs, Jack spun and cut the man across the chest. The snow turned red under their boots. Lyra ducked behind a log, grabbed a burning stick from the fire, and shoved it into the leg of a man trying to flank Jack. He screamed, and she hit him again, harder this time, for the first time in her life. She fought back, but Jack was bleeding. Too much, too fast. One of the men stabbed him near the waist, and Jack dropped to a knee. Still, he didn't stop. He tackled the last one standing and drove his fist into the man's face again and again until the forest went still. Silence, just breathing, and the crackle of a dying fire. Lyra ran to Jack, dropping beside him. His face was pale, his hand covered in blood. "No, no, no," she whispered, pressing her hands against the wound. "Don't go," Jack opened his eyes slowly. "Still here?" he said, coughing, dumb but not dead. She laughed through tears. "You fought for me." He smiled weakly. "You're worth fighting for." They dragged the bodies into the woods and burned what was left. Lyra cleaned Jack's wounds with boiled water and wrapped him in warm blankets. He slept for 2 days, barely waking, and through it all, she stayed, feeding him, caring for him, watching over him like he had done for her. On the 3rd morning, Jack opened his eyes to see Lyra sitting beside him. Her hand was in his eye. "Thought I lost you," she whispered. He smiled faintly. Not yet outside. The snow had stopped. The sky was clear, the air calm. A new season was coming. Lyra stood and said, "I'll get wood for the fire." He reached out and touched her hand. "You're strong," he said. "You've changed." She looked down, then back at him. "No, Jack," she said softly. "You changed me." Spring came quietly. Snow melted into gentle streams, and the first green leaves began to bloom. The cabin stood the same, rough and old. But something inside had changed. It was warmer now, just from the fire, but from the people living. Within it, Jack sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, healing slowly. His ribs still ached, and his limp was worse than before. But he smiled more now. Even with pain in his bones, there was peace in his heart. Lyra sat beside him, carving small wooden animals with a sharp blade she had learned to handle well. She carved in silence, then placed a small fox on Jack's knee. "I made this one for you," she said. Jack turned it over in his rough hand. "Looks better than anything I ever built," he replied, grinning. She had become skilled. Not just with tools or cooking or traps, but with healing too, hers and his. The girl who once shivered in silence now walked with her head held high. She sang in the mornings and told Jack stories from her world at night. even if he didn't understand all the words. He listened to every one. One afternoon, Lyra stood in front of the mirror Jack had hung for her. She was brushing her hair, which had grown long again. She wore a simple dress Jack had sewn by hand crooked. Stitches, uneven lines, but she loved it. Looking at her reflection, she whispered to herself, "I'm still me," then she added, "but I'm not alone anymore." A week later, Jack took her into town. People stared at first. Some whispered, others frowned, but Jack walked tall. And Lyra held his arm with quiet pride at the shop. The trader who once ignored her now offered her fruit for free. Children waved at her, and she smiled shyly. The same people who once called her a stray now called her his girl, and that was enough for her. They returned to the cabin with seeds, tools, and new boots for Lyra. She laughed when Jack tried to measure her foot with a piece of string and got it wrong. "I'll grow into them," she said kindly. "You better." He smirked. They cost a fortune that night. They sat by the fire like always, Jack reading an old book out loud, Lyra listening with her head on his shoulder. Suddenly, she asked, "Jack, can I stay forever?" He paused, lowered the book. "You still think you need to ask?" She looked up. "I just want to be sure." Jack took her hand gently. "You have a place here?" "Lyra, this is your home, and now it's mine too." In the weeks that followed, Lyra built a small garden behind the cabin. She planted roots, herbs, and colorful alien seeds Jack couldn't name. She sung to them every morning, and the garden began to grow just like she had. They made plans, simple ones: fix the roof before summer, trade for more fabric, build a second room. With real windows, Jack had once lived with ghosts. Now he lived with hope. One morning, Jack woke up to find Lyra sitting on the porch steps. Staring at the sunrise, she didn't move as he joined her. He sat beside her and followed her gaze. The sky was gold and pink, stretching wide above the trees. She turned to him and whispered, "I think I finally believe it." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Believe what?" "That I belong somewhere," she said, "that someone wants me. Just for being me." Jack looked at her, eyes soft. "I didn't save you, Lyra," he said. "You saved me." And so, in a small cabin far from the noise of the galaxy, a wounded man and a lost girl built a life, not one of riches or glory, but one of warmth, of second chances, of quiet mornings and shared meals. They had no blood ties, no contracts, no promises written on paper, only the unspoken bond between two souls who had no one else but now had each other together. They faced the future not as a soldier and a runaway, but as a family.